young people graduate and come home, these men and women, if they do business, if they get involved in politics, their their priority will be the country in which they studied.
Sure.
So it will increase Iran's bonds with these countries, and links with the West and the United States will decrease as a result of these policies. So the West is really hurting itself more than anything else in the long run.
Well, that does seem very clear, and it would seem that any rational analysis of those sanctions, historically or currently, one would scrap them. But why do you keep hearing the lobby and the members of Congress say, as they did last week, AIPAC, we want the toughest sanctions in history, and we want more of them?
Well, one can say that the United States is not being a rational actor when it comes to Iran, and that's largely the view from Tehran, that a lot of its policies are based on hatred towards Iran. In fact, many in Iran believe that America's policy in Syria is irrational and based upon a hatred for Iran. If we look at Syria, according to a poll carried out by the BBC last year on the Doha Debates website that belongs to the BBC, the majority of Syrians support the current president, Mr. Bashar Assad. On the other hand, the Americans, in order to overthrow the Syrian government, they've imposed sanctions on ordinary Syrians, meaning trying to hurt ordinary people. And they've aligned themselves with the Saudis and other dictatorships who promote sectarianism, racial hatred, and religious hatred. The Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia just recently said that all churches in the Arabian Peninsula must be destroyed. And clerics in Saudi Arabia are calling for the murder and rape of minority women and children. And these you can find on YouTube. And these are clerics based in Saudi Arabia who are public figures, and they're not harassed or punished for these statements. And the United States, as a result of its hatred for Iran, is effectively, through Saudi Arabia and other such countries, are promoting extremism in Syria and the rise of Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda-like groups in the country. So in the long run, they're actually hurting themselves more than they're hurting anyone else, because what's going on now in the region can be potentially far more dangerous than what happened in Afghanistan.
Yes, and I'm sure that you mean, when you speak of the American government or the American hatred for Iran, you mean the government, because we still recall the excellent relations we've had with the Iranian people during the period you discussed of the exchange programs. And a lot of us think that the Iranian people and the American people have an awfully lot by nature in common. You mentioned Syria. It's nowadays a cliche around here to speak of the spillover from Syria. What's the spillover on this issue, as you see it, in Israel's apparent rush to war?
Well, the major spillover in Syria is that through racial hatred, sectarian hatred, and religious hatred that's being promoted by the dictatorships in the Persian Gulf, there are young people in Syria that are becoming extremists at all levels. And this cannot be limited to Syria itself. We already see a sort of spillover effect in Iraq and in Lebanon. And from the reports that are coming out, we also see it in Turkey as well. If one goes back to the 1980s and 90s, and when Pakistan, through the Saudis and the United States, were helping extremist groups in Afghanistan to oppose the Soviets and to pursue Western and Saudi interests, the country of Pakistan changed dramatically. Pakistan was a very tolerant country over 3 decades ago, where different religious sects lived side by side without any major problem. But because of the huge amounts of money coming in from Saudi Arabia and the promotion of sectarianism and extremist ideologies like Wahhabism and certain trends of Salafism, Pakistan today is a country where you constantly have suicide bombs, where you have mass murders. People are killed basically because of their sect and so on. So Pakistan has changed because of the negative influence of the Saudi regime. And this is something that countries like Turkey should be very worried about. Dealing with extremists like the Saudis, who are only in this for self-preservation. The Saudis are not after democracy. After all, they have no democracy. They're probably the most backward country and reactionary country in the world. But the Saudis want to export their extremist ideology in order for the regimes in the region to become unstable, and so that the will of the people cannot move in the proper direction. Therefore, the Saudis and other such dictatorships will be able to keep their thrones, these families.
Yes, your description it shows it's complicated indeed. On the point about Turkey, the Turkish government regime opposes the Assad regime, and the Assad regime is supporting the Kurds to some extent, some of the Kurds, which is anathema to the Ankara regime. How do you see the Syrian situation affecting the Kurds, even in Iran? Of course, there are Kurds in Iraq and Syria and Turkey. They're speaking of autonomy. Is that possibly an outcome of this crisis in Syria, and would that impact the Kurdish community in Iran?
Well, percentage-wise, Kurds in Iran are much smaller in number than in comparison to Turkey and Iraq.
30% in Turkey, 10% in Syria? Roughly.
Yes, and in Iran it would be roughly 4 or 5%.
4 or 5, yes.
But the Kurdish community in Iran is much closer to Iranians culturally. For example, the Iranian New Year, the Nowruz, is something that is celebrated by Kurds and Iranians. So the cultural similarities between among Iranians is much stronger than, for example, in Turkey. And the Iranians don't feel threatened by what is going on in the region. But what is interesting is that what the Turks are doing is, as I said earlier, by promoting extremism, this spillover is quite possible and is happening. But also, as you point out, the Syrians are forced to retaliate. So as Turkey interferes in Syrian internal affairs, it should not feel that it is being wronged when Syria potentially interferes in Turkish affairs. So if the Turks are supporting militants in Syria, then Syria would feel that it has the same right to do the same thing in Turkey. And so this itself shows how that the Turkey is, what sort of price the Turks are paying for this intervention. It is ironic that Assad is being shown as a monster in the Western media, and Iran's position is shown as inhuman. But in reality, the Iranian policy from the very start is that the Syrian government must carry out reforms in a peaceful manner, and that Assad and his opponents should stand for elections and the people choose. The Americans and their allies are adamant that free and fair elections do not happen. They are forcing the country towards civil war. When, for example, the Arab League monitors went to Syria, initially it was said that they were supported. When their reports ran against the Western media and what the Arab dictatorships were saying, suddenly they were demonized. Then later on, when the Annan plan came forward and he called for a ceasefire, these Arab dictatorships like Saudi Arabia officially began supporting the militants in Syria with Western support. So basically the West, Turkey, and these dictatorships are pushing for civil war in the country, and as a result of their policies, many thousands of Syrians have died, and they have a lot of blood on their hands. Whereas the Iranian position has from the start been a moral one, that Syria needs to reform, but that the reforms must be carried out peacefully, and all sides must be able to participate in government.
The Iranian government wants more dialogue on the nuclear issue, and the White House suggests that they do also. The Israelis are opposed to it. What's behind this declaration that came out of Tel Aviv? Actually, it was in this morning's New York Times again, where there's a demand by the Israeli government that the international community, I guess, or the White House declare that the diplomatic process failed and it's over. What's your take on that?
Well, to be honest, this is not very different from the American position, because the Americans, while they're speaking of the diplomatic process, in negotiations with Iran, the Americans are demanding that Iran accept all the Western conditions and then for the two sides to begin moving forward. In other words, they want Iran to capitulate, to give up its rights, and then serious negotiations to begin. And that is what really has prevented the talks so far from advancing. The Iranians are willing to give and take. As long as Iran's sovereignty is accepted, Iran's right to nuclear enrichment is accepted. If these things are accepted, the Iranians are willing to be more open, to allow more intrusive inspections, so that Western countries will not feel that there is any threat if that is truly what the issue is. The Iranians are doubtful. The Iranians believe that the West really knows that Iran is not after nuclear weapons, and that this is being used as an excuse to put pressure on the country because of Iran's opposition to Israel and to Zionism. And if it wasn't the nuclear program, it would be human rights or terrorism or something else. They would use something else to put pressure on the country. But in general, the Israeli position also shows that how irrational and violent the regime is, that they do not want negotiations, they want violence. And this is another irony, that Iran is constantly demonized in the Western media, yet Iran has never threatened Israel with any military attack. Yeah. And Israel is constantly threatening Iran, and so is the United States. In fact, the statement once that in the West is repeated by the media that Ahmadinejad threatened Israel is a willful mistranslation of what he said. He said once upon a time that Israel must cease to exist, and in Persian it basically meant that Israel must cease to exist as a political entity, just as apartheid South Africa ceased to exist. And therefore, Iran has never made any threat to the Israeli regime, yet we see constant threats made against Iran, yet there is no outrage or moral outrage in the Western media or among Western governments.
Yes. Professor Marandi, my producer says that our time is up, unfortunately, because we have a number more questions we wanted to ask you. I thank you for joining us for this edition of Between the Lines. And ladies and gentlemen, from Between the Lines, coming to you from Beirut, we thank you for joining us this week. We wish you goodbye, good luck, and Eid Mubarak. Thank you.